everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinzler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how you doing?
I'm doing great.
It's a great time of year, isn't it? We're finally in June, and it may actually seem like July, but things are really popping in the yard.
And that's one of my favorites, is watching everything grow.
It's a great time. Well, before we get too far, we want to let you know that this podcast is sponsored by the Bloomfield Garden Center, a family-owned retail greenhouse providing locally grown plants since 1974. And you can find them 1 mile south of Sabin, Minnesota, or 6 miles south of I-94 off the I-94 exit 6. Just a quick drive from Fargo-Moorhead. Don, I got to admit, we try to start this show every week with a joke that's kind of relating to the topic that week.
Well, gardening is lighthearted. It makes us all happy.
It's fun. It's fun, but, we're talking about weeds this week, and it's hard to find jokes about weeds.
I guess that's because humor in weeds.
There's not much humor. I guess you could say weeds are no laughing matter. But I did find this one. What weeds make gardeners the most grouchy?
Well, I don't know, because they do make me awfully grouchy. So I don't know which weeds do make us most grouchy.
It's a topic of today's show. It's crabgrass. We want. It
certainly makes me crabby.
It is. It's a tough thing. We want to talk about this because, like we said, we're recording this in early June. Weeds have been popping up for a while, and I think we really need to get on top of weeds, don't we?
Do you know how much easier my life would be if we didn't have weeds growing? Because I love gardening, vegetables, flowers, the whole thing, and how much easier my life would be without weeds. Your
life would be easier, but I hate to say, isn't there probably some job security in talking about weeds?
Yes, because they're all over.
Because we keep having to deal with them. So, why? Let's just start with the basic thing, like, why not let things go to weed? Why do we need to weed?
That's a great question. Why not just kind of let them exist, live and let live? Because weeds will take over and they'll drain the energy, the moisture, the nutrients from the plants that we want. That brings up a good point, though. Okay, what is a weed? Now, okay, one of the worst weeds in my flower garden and vegetables are elm seedlings.
Yes,
because they drop down bushels of these seeds, and elm seeds have no dormancy required, so they start sprouting right away. And so in my flowers and perennial gardens and the vegetables, I've got all these elms popping up. So is elm a weed? Well, the definition of a weed is any plant growing where you don't want it.
Right.
So sometimes I have people send me photos. Is this a weed? Well, it depends. Depends on, is it growing where you don't want it. So generally that's the basis is something growing where you don't want it. That's a weed, and how do we control it?
Well, yeah, so let's talk about the elm seeds, because that had just happened to us, and we've been out trying to blow some of the seedlings out. What's the best way to handle elm seedlings?
Well, because they'll pop up, and it's really annoying, like in a perennial flower garden.
Yeah.
Iris peonies, and you have these tree seedlings that pop up, and over the course of a summer, they get quite well rooted, and then it's hard to get them out. Well, there are a couple options. Yeah, maybe we'll talk about these right away. A couple of options. One is to, if you do, like with a leaf blower, try to blow some of those seeds out if you see them. And secondly, there are weed preventers. The most common is called preen, P-R-E-E-N. Those are granules that you sprinkle on flower gardens, and they're meant to keep things from sprouting, weed seeds.
Okay.
And tree seeds are kind of tough, but there's a possibility that will work. So follow the directions on preen. That might help prevent some of these tree seedlings from sprouting. Otherwise, the key is when you see them sprouting, get them when they're small and easy to pull out. I found after a rain or after you've watered, they'll pull out. But when you see a tree seedling, it's tempting to say, well, gosh, it's kind of small, but they grow fast. And the more they grow, the more difficult to pull them out. And then if they're in place for about one growing season, you may not be able to pull them out. You may have to try to dig them out in the middle of an iris clump or something like that. So, try to prevent if you can, but when they sprout, get them when they're tiny. I wish I had a better suggestion. I get emails from people wondering, gosh, isn't there something we can spray over the top of our perennial garden that will kill these little weed seedlings? But there's nothing that will, or these tree seedlings or other weeds, there's nothing that will selectively kill those out with affecting the good plants.
Yeah. So you talked about a little bit about this, but when is the best time to weed? Is it better, like let's say, is it better in the morning? Is it better, you said kind of sometimes if it's a little moist, so after a rain, or is it better early in the year or later in the year?
Yeah, the key is probably the moisture because they're easier to pull out when, of course, it's moist. Sometimes weeds have a way of just hugging tight into dry soil, so moisture greatly helps in pulling those out. And I suppose for comfort, morning or evening is probably more comfortable for us. That's interesting, though, you mentioned that. At first, I kind of chuckle, what time of day is better to do your weeding? I think, well, does the weed really care? But actually it does. Okay, for us, the comfort level in morning or evening might be better, but in the middle of the day, the heat of the day, like when you're hoeing a vegetable garden, the weeds that are coming up, the middle of the day, the heat of the day is actually better weed kill because as you're bringing those little weed seedlings to the surface, the sun will dehydrate them and kill them more efficiently. Whereas if you were hoeing in the kind of the cool of the night, if it's a little moisture, they might re-root easier. So for killing weeds, even though it's less comfortable for us, actually the middle of the day, heat of the day might be more efficient.
All right. Well, we're going to take a quick little break, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about weed control, how to take care of them, and the different kinds of weeds.
Weed control might be one of the greatest issues all of us gardeners have.
I think it's probably a very universal thing. No matter what zone you're in, you have to deal with it.
It is.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
Okay, we're back and we're talking about taking care of the weeds in your lawn and garden. And we've talked a little bit about garden weeds, and I just want to stick with that for one more question. Is there a way to kind of smother weeds? Because I know, like in my garden, we've tried to get rid of certain things in certain areas. Like we had a mint patch, and that's incredibly. Those are super invasive.
Invasive.
So you really kind of want to keep those under control. And we smothered that. We put down a plastic tarp and we put mulch on top of that. Can you do that to control kind of most weeds in your yard?
Smothering is a great way to prevent or kill a lot of existing weeds because we're all about the wise use of any chemicals, and smothering, of course, is a good non-chemical way to control some weeds. So let me tell you about our own experience. Okay, we planted several big perennial flower gardens, and there was a lot of weeds in it, perennial weeds, like thistle, quackgrass, etc. And I knew that if I didn't do something in these perennial gardens after I planted them, we're going to have just weeds all over. So mulch to smother, and that's basically what mulch will do is smother. But I knew that just laying mulch onto the soil, those perennial weeds were probably going to poke right on through. So I needed more teeth right on top of the soil. So there would be a couple of choices. You mentioned like smothering with plastic, or you could use landscape fabric. What I chose for our perennial gardens, don't laugh, cardboard.
Okay.
I used cardboard.
I promise not to laugh, but I did.
Cardboard laid flat and overlap good so that the weeds can't come up in between joints. But cardboard and then shredded bark over that.
Okay.
And that works really good in a perennial garden. Also, when I plant trees, and I want a circle of mulch around there to keep the weeds and the grass from growing right next to the tree trunk, I lay cardboard down and then shredded bark. What that will do is the cardboard will disintegrate over time just into a natural organic type material, and it will stay in place for 2 to 3 years, I've found. In the meantime, it totally smothers out weeds and is a quite effective method for weed control. So smothering is absolutely great. So smothering, like in a perennial bed, smother the weeds, cover the material with mulch, and you've smothered the weeds very efficiently. Also, what if you're trying to get rid of, like the mint, was it?
Yeah.
That was invasive, or if you've got a patch of quackgrass or thistle, then you can, even if you're not going to mulch over that, you can smother it with black plastic or fabric. Now, it probably would take for that to totally smother and kill out, a good half of a growing season. Some of those perennial type weeds have a root system that has stored energy.
Okay.
So if the smothering isn't long enough, they'll just come right on through when the smothering material was taken off.
Okay. And I suppose one of the good things kind of about the cardboard is it's a little bit easier to cut. Like if you want, because if you're doing this in a garden that's already established and you just kind of, let's say you've got an area kind of between the base of the plants and the border where you just kind of want to make sure nothing comes up in front of those, it's easier maybe to cut the strips of cardboard than it would
to
be
the exact size, right?
Than to cut the black plastic fabric, because then you've also got to stake that into the ground or find a way to weight that down, even if you've got the
exactly.
The
of course, the cardboard needs to be weighted down with something. Yeah. But in the vegetable garden too, mulches can be used quite effectively to smother, like in between the rows, right up to the vegetables or around tomato plants. Mulches. Now, okay, what if you just want to use mulch plain, some sort of mulch? Could be dried grass clippings that haven't been treated with herbicide. That could be a mulch. In order for that to block out weeds, if you put no underlayment underneath, it really needs to be at least 3 inches thick. If it's just a light layer, the weeds will push right through that.
Yeah. What other tools should people be using when they weeding? Because like we've talked about, the weeding is just a topic we always have to deal with every year. People are always, quote unquote, inventing new tools or different gadgets.
Gardeners love gadgets and tools.
Yes. Well, that's the reason you have to have a garden. You have to have a shed, or you have to have a section in the garage for things.
Exactly, for all our tools.
So what do you use?
Okay, what I use, and a good weeding hoe is, that's my favorite tool. Okay, and I just recently bought one. I ordered it online, but some of the garden centers do have them. I ordered, and it was over $100, which may seem like a lot for a weeding hoe. It's a long-handled hoe.
Okay.
But what makes it so expensive, now that's going to last a lifetime.
Yeah.
I just disposed of my, because the handle broke, the hoe that my mom used, and that was at least 60 years old, maybe longer. So a good quality tool is going to last a lifetime of gardening anyway. So anyway, what makes this tool special is it has steel that is able to be sharpened, so high quality steel, because a good weeding hoe should be almost razor sharp.
Okay.
And I use a hand file to file it, keep it a good edge.
Okay.
Sometimes when I'm weeding, I'll carry a file in my back pocket and just dress the edge up to keep it sharp. A sharp hoe will glide through soil easily in getting those weeds off. And also a thin hoe, the blade, the metal part of the hoe, should be just thin, not a big blocky type hoe. You don't need to pull all that soil through. It just needs to be a very narrow blade that will glide through. So hopefully I'm painting that picture good of a narrow blade, sharp, that will glide through the soil surface. Because the key to getting these weeds when you're hoeing is to get them when they're tiny, when they're just barely breaking the soil surface, and then a well-sharpened hoe will glide through that surface and cut those right off. If you let the weeds age, they become a tough to hoe. and so anyway, that's my favorite. Another tool that's less sophisticated, but my second favorite tool is a table knife.
Okay.
How am I describing it?
Like a butter knife?
Bread and butter knife? Yeah, butter knife.
A little rounded edge.
Yeah, exactly. I always wash it before I put it back in the in the silverware
You don't
drawer.
just keep it in the garage.
Actually, I do have an old one I just keep in the garage. But anyway, what I use that for is hoeing, weeding right next to plants. For example, a row of carrots in the garden. With that table knife, I can go along and fine-tune after I've hoed in between the rows with with the hoe. Then I can fine-tune right next to the row of carrots or other vegetables with that table knife. I just get down on my hands and knees and go along, and that works beautifully. Or around like perennial flowers or other flowers, you can almost surgically remove the weeds that are growing right next to plants. So that's my second. And between the two of those, then of course I got a rototiller and other tools as well. But for weeding, long-handled hoe, well sharpened, and a butter knife, table knife.
My girlfriend Sam bought herself a shorter handle. I think I can't remember. It was called some kind of like a Japanese weeding knife or Japanese weeding, and it's got a little bit of it's kind of a slightly different edge, but it's still very, very sharp. And
those are awesome.
Yeah, and again, it's for getting down there and really kind of doing some finesse work.
Yes, that's an even better tool than my table knife.
Right. Costs a little bit more, but like you said, a good quality tool will last a long time. You just have to take care of it a little bit. And
exactly.
What about, so I'm 52. I'm going to age myself. I'm 52. My knees are not what they used to be. My back is not what I used to be. I get down there and I have a cushion. Do you use a cushion? Or do you wear knee pads? Or do you not?
I wear knee pads if I'm going to be out there doing a lot.
Okay.
For kind of like a whole day, or I use a kind of a kneeling pad.
Yeah.
If I'm going to go here to there. Because it's hard.
It's hard on the knees.
Okay, there are some things with my long-handled hoe that I can hoe just standing up. But there are other times when weeding, you need to get right down to it, like picking young tree seedlings out of a clump of peonies.
Yeah.
You need to get right down in there.
So, so when you pull out the weeds, let's say if you're doing this by hand, what do you do? Do you keep a bucket with you and then just bring them?
That's a good question.
Or do you just I know I've seen some people just throw them kind of into the yard or.
Okay. It depends on the type of weed.
Okay.
I think a person should carry along a 5-gallon bucket and put the weeds in that. There's some weeds will not resprout. For example, these little tree seedlings, you pull them out, lay them on the surface, the sun is going to fry them off. They're not okay. But other weeds such as purslane, which is that ground-hugging,
rounded
spreads
leaf.
Out, a rounded leaf, yeah.
Kind of purplish?
Yeah, purplish reddish.
Yeah.
Purplish reddish, greenish, hugs the ground.
Yep.
Purslane. And that one is so annoying. If you pull it or hoe it, and if that is left in place, it will re-root easily and readily. So those have to be physically removed out of the garden.
And purslane is one of those ones that if it were in an area that I did not, it doesn't bother me if it's not like
it's edible.
Yeah, and exactly.
I've tried it with ranch dressing. It's
anything with ranch dressing.
It's delightful. Yeah.
But purslane is something that if it were in an area that I wasn't trying to grow something in, that would be a weed that I would kind of just
one
let
purslane
go,
plant has been known to produce several 100,000 weeds, and they can shoot those weed seeds up to 40 feet, and they remain viable in the soil for up to 25 years. So I'm tenacious about not letting purslane go in the garden. But I battle it because, if they last 25 years, I'm sure I have 25 years worth of just existing, even if I don't let them seed. That'll keep me weeding.
Do you have a most hated weed? A weed that's like
is among them because you can't hoe them and leave them because they re-root. So purslane, and then of course the perennial weeds such as thistle, dandelion, quackgrass, because they have such an established root system. If you don't get all the root system, they just pop right back up, and of course they keep coming back year after year. So we should at some point talk about the annuals and perennials and the difference.
Yep, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But since we're talking tools still, one more thing, or one more kind of genre of tools is I've seen, like, especially for the lawns, because of dandelions and thistles and things like that, I've seen different kind of tools where you kind of put it in place, like maybe over the center of then you stomp on it. Yeah, and it stomps on it, and then you can give it a twist and pull it out. Have you tried any of those?
I haven't tried that, but I've used a long-handled butcher knife on, sometimes I'm simple, long-handled butcher knife to cut out dandelions, and that's effective. But that dandelion dandelion grabber is neat. It goes down in, and if you grab enough of the root, dandelions won't come back. Thistles, there's enough of a root that it's going to come back. But that grabber, I think, works well for dandelions and plantain, which is kind of a broadleaf. So for some of the weeds in the lawn, that can work quite well. And I suppose that could work in a flower garden too.
Yeah.
On some of the
probably
weeds.
work a little bit easier in a flower garden because the lawn wouldn't be the lawn, so the ground wouldn't be as compacted. I would think it would be a little bit looser. Things would probably come up a little bit easier. But hopefully also in a flower garden or a vegetable garden, you've been at it a little bit, maybe a little bit more. I think we can tend to let the lawn weeds go a little bit, and sometimes you think, a mowing will take care of that, but it really doesn't.
Yeah, but like in flower gardens and vegetable gardens, I think the weeds are even more of a problem, aren't they?
Yeah. So these things that when you stick something into the ground and you pull it up, you tend to pull up a good amount of dirt too. And even if you're using your butcher knife, is that a problem with leaving these kind of pockets, or do you go around and do you try to refill that section of lawn with dirt just to kind of make sure that you're not leaving divots kind of in the yard?
Yeah, in the yard when I cut them out with like a butcher knife, I usually just kind of feather in the surrounding enough. Yeah.
All right.
But in a flower garden, you probably would want to, at least bring in a little soil from the surrounding.
All right, and when we come back, we're going to take a little break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about the difference between annual and perennial weeds, and also we're going to talk about herbicides, because there's a lot of information there, and there's a lot of differences.
It can be confusing. There's a lot of products on the market.
All right, well, we'll be right back.
When you can't make it to City Hall or school board meetings, local journalists from Inforum.com will be there to report the facts and get your questions answered. Local news works for you. Stay up to date at Inforum.com.
All right, we're back, and this week we're talking about weeds, and we talked about this a little bit before, but let's start with what is the difference between an annual and perennial weed? Because you've said a weed is basically anything that's growing in an area where you don't want it to grow. That's the general term, but there are some specific terms you should know about which weeds you're attacking.
It is important to know whether the weed is an annual or perennial, and here's why. Okay, first of all, an annual weed is a weed that sprouts from seed, grows during the growing season, and then it dies over winter. Okay, so it's not going to come back to haunt you the next year if you didn't allow it to go to seed, because those seeds would come back. Okay, perennial weeds are weeds that will come back year after year from a winter hardy root system. That's like dandelions, thistles, quackgrass. And the reason they're of even more concern is because the winter isn't going to kill them. If you don't deal with them, they're going to be there as long as you're gardening. They aren't going to die out. So at least annuals, if there's a redeeming quality of those, at least the frost is going to kill them at the end of the season. So it is important to know, am I dealing with something that's a perennial going to always come back? Or at the end of, in September, if it's an annual, I don't worry about that so much, a weed, because it's going to just die. So important to know the difference between the two.
Yeah.
And, of course, the most common perennial, there's all kinds of annual weeds, but the perennial weeds that we most commonly deal with are the thistle that I mentioned, dandelions, quackgrass. There are others like creeping Charlie, creeping Jenny.
And talking about the thistle and dandelions, there are times when I've got down into the yard and tried to dig them up. And when you pull up, if you can get it up by the whole root, you should feel good about yourself. That is you take a picture of that. Yes. Because I have pulled them up, and I have, not lying, I've seen roots that are 6 to 8, maybe even 9 inches long.
Definitely.
Those tap roots really get down there.
They really, really do.
And that's just to show you really kind of how entrenched they are in the winter.
Now that brings up a good question. Could you totally kill those out, perennial weeds such as thistle, if you just keep digging and digging? You can, if as soon as they resprout, before they have a chance to do a lot of photosynthesis and rebuild themselves. As soon as that thistle appeared, if you cut it off again and keep cutting it off, it can drain itself out of energy and disappear. But as soon as you let it grow very much, it'll recharge itself, and then it's right back where it started. So it's possible to, in some farm fields, just frequent cultivation. As soon as a weed appears, you can get rid of them that way.
I suppose mowing may not really work for that.
Usually
because we want to keep our blades up a little bit higher.
Exactly.
And it won't really
So
cut
for thistle and
them off.
dandelions, they still have enough of a photosynthesis surface down near the lower down, so they keep replenishing themselves.
Well, because this is weeding, and people are always kind of looking for not necessarily an easy answer, but they looking for an answer. And one of the answers that people look to is herbicides.
Right. A common question to me is, I've got these weeds growing. What can I spray?
Right.
That's a common question. And of course, we're all waiting for some magical elixir that we could spray over our area, and it would just remove the weeds, anything we don't want growing. And of course, that's never going to happen. But okay. So what can we spray? Okay, herbicides. Interesting definition of herbicides. An herbicide isn't something that will kill weeds. The definition of herbicide is a product that will kill plants. So an herbicide, a weed killer that will kill dandelions, will also kill your tomato plants. So that's why it's very important to know the product that a person is going to be using, these herbicides. And generally, herbicides can be classified into 3 categories. Again, it's kind of important to know those 3 categories. Okay, the first category are herbicides that will kill broadleaf weeds. Now, broadleaf weeds, I should say broadleaf plants. Okay, so broadleaf weed, think of dandelion. Okay, that's a broadleaf. Your tomato is a broadleaf.
Okay.
Trees are broadleaves. Okay, so an herbicide that kills broadleaf weeds or broadleaf plants. Okay, next we have the category of herbicides that kills grasses. Such as lawn grass or quackgrass or any other grass plants. You see, grasses are in a separate botanical class as the broadleaves, okay? So if there are some herbicides that selectively kill just grasses. So a good news is that if grass is growing in your peony plant, or in your shrubbery, there are specific herbicides that will just kill grasses. Okay. So there's a third category of herbicides. Okay, we've got those that kill broadleaf, like dandelions or tomatoes.
Yep.
We've got the grass killers that will kill quackgrass. It would also kill your lawn grass if you got it on that. Okay, the third category is an herbicide that will kill all plants. Broadleafs, grasses, everything. And that is glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in the original Roundup.
Okay.
Yeah,
and that
so
is just
Roundup, unless something's been genetically modified, Roundup will kill whatever it touches.
it's just kind of like napalm in the yard. It's just going to
Exactly. So it's
kill it
important
all.
to understand that there are these 3 types of herbicides. And so on our lawn, we would use a broadleaf herbicide to get out the broadleaf dandelions.
Yep.
Because that won't kill grass.
Yep.
And if we're looking to get grass out of our strawberries, we would use a grass killer because that only kills grass. And of course, strawberries aren't a grass, so it would leave those. But now, what if we wanted to kill like everything in an area? Then the glyphosate would work. Or you could selectively use glyphosate to spot treat things. So what if I have a thistle growing right next to a rose bush? Okay, well, glyphosate would kill both. But I could very carefully spot treat that thistle with glyphosate, making sure no droplets get on the rose bush, and kill it that way. Because such as glyphosate is a fairly potent material, and so it would work better than, like on thistle, than one of the other types of things.
And so like a lot of the times these will come with a long wand, and you can kind of control a little bit by getting that really into the thing that you really want to spray, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The other thing that's very important is to always read the label. The label is a legal document. And so using any of these herbicides in a way that the label doesn't indicate is actually unlawful. So it's very important to follow the directions on these. Another thing, when I mentioned glyphosate has become controversial because in the past it has been known to be a carcinogen on farm workers that had used it repeatedly. But so another thing on the label of any of these products is always to wear protective clothing. Now, glyphosate has no soil carryover. It's deactivated by soil. So glyphosate can be used properly, a very good herbicide to use. Now, I mentioned soil carryover. We have to be kind of careful because some herbicides do remain in the soil. For example, there's one called dicamba, which can, if applied to the lawn, it is very effective on dandelions and different weeds without harming grass. It's a broadleaf weed killer.
Okay.
Dicamba can move down into the soil and be taken up by tree roots.
Oh.
Exactly. And that can affect the growth of the tree, causing death if, strong enough dose. So some of these products we have to use very judiciously, and that's why maybe it seems like I'm dwelling on it, but knowing what product you're using is very, very important.
I guess that's a question too for things, like they can go different things like that dicamba can really go to the tree roots. How about, are there things that are safe for use in a yard? Let's say you have a fenced-in yard with animals, like we do with dogs. What things would be safe to use around pets?
Yeah, most of the lawn-type herbicides indicate that it's safe to re-enter after the product has dried.
Okay.
And so check the individual label, but in most cases, pets and children or other humans should not be allowed onto the lawn when that product is wet. There is a product that can be used, it's fairly good on some of the hard-to-control weeds in lawn. The active ingredient is triclopyr, TRI, and that has less soil movement. And again, it's very important, like even on lawn weed, to make sure that nothing drifts onto the other shrubbery and things, because those chemicals that are killing dandelions can't distinguish between your dogwood shrub or your basswood tree or your tomato plants. So again, herbicides can be very, very effective. We'd have a hard time farming or even gardening without them. It's possible, but used properly and safely, they can be great weed help.
What about something like a product like a weed and feed? We've talked about lawn care before.
Yes.
But, weed and feed
They don't work well.
They don't work well?
No.
Okay.
I get a lot of emails from people saying, gosh, I were disappointed. How come my weed and feed really didn't control that much? Two factors. One is the granules in weed and feed, the weeding part of the product. When you read the label, those granules have to stick to the weed leaves. The weeds have to, first of all, be actively growing.
Okay.
They aren't generally preventatives, so the weeds have to already be growing, like the dandelions. And then the granules have to cling to those leaves so that the weed killer can actually penetrate the leaf. And so the directions oftentimes say to apply when it's dewy or right after you've watered. And so weed and feed is kind of tricky. Not as effective as an actual spray spot type treatment for lawn weeds.
All right. I guess the thing that we're learning is that weed control can be done and there's no easy answer except for just to get out and do it.
Exactly. We're all looking for, I'd love some magic thing I could do so I wouldn't have to weed. But I look at it as kind of a challenge. It's us against them. And I look at it as kind of an interesting challenge to get these weeds and make my garden and everything grow well. And like you said, there's no magic elixir. It's getting out there and doing it. And get them when they're small and don't let them go to seed.
So just another thing to do on your checklist and your gardening to-do list.
One thing I really like to do in the evening, especially in the perennial garden when it's fun to see what's blooming, or the landscape, walk around each evening and just pick a few weeds that you find. And if you get on top of it, then there aren't too many to pull. But as my little elm seedlings pop up all over, then I try to get them when they're small and just walk through the area and do a little each day. And in the vegetable garden, gosh, getting them the weeds when they're just breaking the soil surface, it's actually fun to go along and hoe. But if they start growing as high as the vegetables, then that's work.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it can be kind of fun. Like eating popcorn, you kind of, it's fascinating to see if you can get ahead of them.
The other thing too is that if you let it go, and like you're saying, like in a vegetable garden where you're seeing, maybe not as many weeds as your vegetables, it becomes discouraging and you lose kind of interest and you can kind of give up.
There's nothing more disheartening than a weed-filled like vegetable garden where the thing is just solid and you can't tell what's vegetable and what's weeds.
Yeah.
That is very disheartening.
But the other thing too is that the amount of pride you can feel after you get down on your hands and knees and you clean a section and you look at it and it's all clean and it looks so good. You feel so good, and your knees may ache a little bit and your back may ache, but you think like for somebody like me who sits at a computer all day, it is nice to go out and do some physical work and to actually to see that. It's very rewarding, I think.
It is. And when you weed around plants, whether it's a vegetable garden or flowers, you're rescuing that plant because those weeds and kind of what makes them weeds they're so tenacious. And those weeds are robbing both moisture and nutrients from the plants. So with each weed that you pull, you're rescuing that good plant.
So speaking of good plants and not necessarily weeding, but we had an interesting question. Somebody had written in with a question for you, and let's talk about that one a little bit.
Yeah, a reader sent me, a listener sent me a photo of a hydrangea.
Yeah.
And the hydrangea leaves were quite yellow, but the vein on the leaf was remarkably green. So that's very typical of an iron deficiency chlorosis, it's called. The chlorosis is a yellowing of the leaf where the vein still remains green. So what I suggested was visit the garden center and look for a product called iron.
Chelated iron.
Yeah, chelated iron is the correct term. And those are products that are available, that iron will be available to the shrub. So these hydrangea shrubs, if the chelated iron is applied, then it should turn it to a nice green again. I suggested also giving it some all-purpose fertilizer.
Yeah, I've worked with chelated irons because we have a maple tree that
they get chlorosis easily, the iron deficiency chlorosis, especially in our heavy clay soil.
And so just a word of warning, it's easy to use. It can look like it's going to stain, so don't wear white when you do it. Wear some work clothes because it gets this kind of really deep rusty, it's really a beautiful deep rusty red color. And then we drill holes around the drip line of the tree.
Commonly used on maple and trees that suffer. It'll kind of make your hands a little bit dirty, but it will wash off. So don't be afraid to use it. It's not a hard, difficult thing. Shrubs that are commonly affected, like the hydrangea. Another one, roses are commonly. Anyone growing aronia, which is we got to do a whole podcast on shrubs or fruiting shrubs.
Oh,
sometimes.
I'd love to. That would be great.
Aronia berries makes a very nice landscape shrub too.
I think that they'll get chlorosis. I think there was an aronia berry festival somewhere in this region a couple of years ago. I'm not sure if it's an annual thing.
Yeah, I smell a podcast coming on. We'll have to do that.
Yeah, that may be a good reason for a road trip too.
Yes.
Well, if people have questions, Don, what's the best way to reach you?
Email me and include a photo if you like, if there's an issue. And the email address is donald.kinzler, that's KINZLER, at ndsu.edu.
All right. Well, until next week, I'm John Lamb.
And Don Kinzler. Have a good week.
Growing Together, a gardening podcast, is sponsored by Bloomfield Garden Center, a family-owned retail greenhouse providing locally grown plants since 1974. You can find them 1 mile north of Sabin, Minnesota, or 6 miles south of I-94 at exit 6. Just a quick drive from Fargo-Moorhead.